It was as if the world were too small to contain her pace. Early in the morning, even before sunrise, she was already on her feet, moving back and forth with an energy that seemed more like nervousness than enthusiasm. Each step echoed like a reminder that she couldn't or didn't want to stop. I remember watching her, trying to understand where such urgency came from. It wasn't just about meeting commitments, paying bills, or fitting more tasks into the day. There was something different. Restlessness that seemed to reside deep in her eyes, as if, with every second she stood still, she was closer to facing something she'd rather keep locked away. And then I began to wonder, is this rush really about the now, or about what happens when we're alone with our own thoughts? Maybe you've seen this in someone, or maybe, if you look honestly, you've felt it in yourself. That urge to grab your phone in the silence. The urge to open the fridge even when you're not hungry, just to get something done. The urge to occupy yourself with any task, no matter how trivial, just to keep the emptiness from creeping in. Carl Jung said that what we avoid facing within ourselves doesn't disappear. On the contrary, it remains there, patiently waiting for an opening to reveal itself. And ironically, it's precisely in our haste, in our rush, that we create the illusion that we're safe from this revelation. The curious thing is that haste, in the eyes of others, can be seen as a virtue. We live in a society that values productivity, the "I don't have time for anything" attitude, as if it were a badge of honor. People in a hurry seem important, sought after, necessary. But what few realize is that, for some, this rush is more about escape than conquest, because when the body slows down and silence sets in, there are no distractions. And in this emptiness, the truths we try to hide begin to knock on the door. She, for example, was rarely alone without turning on the television, radio or cell phone. There was always background noise, a conversation, something to keep her mind from wandering to unwanted places. It wasn't fear of external silence, it was fear of internal silence. And I began to understand that haste is like invisible armor. On the outside, it appears as strength, efficiency, focus. On the inside, it's often fear. Fear of feeling too much, fear of remembering things that hurt, fear of realizing that, despite all the rushing, there's still an empty space, begging to be looked at. And of course, there's also the unconscious side of this rush. Those who rush constantly aren't always fully aware of what they're trying to avoid. It's as if the body itself has learned over the years to stay busy to protect the mind from plunging into dangerous territory. Jung called this the shadow. Everything we reject in ourselves and push into the darkest corners of our being. But the shadow doesn't disappear. It just waits for the moment we stop rushing to present itself. And the more we try to escape, the more it finds ways to manifest itself, sometimes subtly, other times devastatingly. The truth is that at some point, rushing stops being a choice and becomes a way of survival. But living this way comes at a cost. Life begins to pass so quickly that we stop feeling, noticing the details, savoring the moments. We become experts at arriving, but incapable of being there. It's as if we're always packed to go, even when there's no trip in sight. And with each goal achieved, we're already thinking about the next, as if the present were just a corridor we need to cross as quickly as possible. But what if, for a moment, we stopped? Not to rest our bodies, but to listen to what they and our minds have to say. That's the challenge. Stopping means making room for uncomfortable questions. What am I trying to avoid? What scares me so much about silence? Why do I feel like I always need to be ahead of the curve? These questions don't always yield easy answers, but ignoring them doesn't make them disappear. On the contrary, they pile up like unopened cards on the table, until one day there's no way to pretend they're not there. Haste, in this sense, is like a well-crafted disguise. From the outside, you see someone committed, hard-working, always ready. But those who can see beyond it realize that, behind this energy, There's a heart beating fast, not only because of the body's rhythm, but also because of the fear of what might happen if it slows down. It's like running at night on a deserted road. You don't know exactly what lies ahead, but you feel like you can't stop to find out. And so we carry on, believing the solution is to keep running, when perhaps the true relief lies in stopping and looking back. In the end, what haste tries to hide isn't always a big secret or a deep trauma. Sometimes it's just the fear of feeling vulnerable, of facing a forgotten emotion, of accepting that we're not in control of everything. But to discover this, it takes courage to slow down, and courage, ironically, is something haste never lets us cultivate. Before I continue, let me ask you something from the bottom of my heart. If this reflection has already started to resonate with you, take advantage of it now and subscribe to the channel. Here we delve into these conversations that stir the soul and provide answers we sometimes didn't even know we were looking for. And leave a comment. Are you the type of person who's always rushing around, or do you enjoy the silence? I'd love to know, because it will further enrich the upcoming stories and reflections. The truth is that haste, when unobserved, becomes a subtle vice. And subtle vices are dangerous because they disguise themselves as virtues. It's like someone who prides themselves on working non-stop but doesn't realize that, deep down, work is just a shield against internal discomfort. Jung talked a lot about these unconscious defense mechanisms, small strategies we use to avoid contact with what's repressed. And haste is one of the most effective because the modern world applauds this behavior. Have you ever noticed how, when we have a free moment, we rarely just stare into space? Our first reaction is to grab our phone, scroll, open something to fill that tiny space of time. It seems harmless, but it's a clear sign that we can no longer stand being without stimulation. It's as if, in the silence, something inside us awakens, and we don't want to deal with it. This constant need to occupy ourselves is a sign that there may be internal issues waiting to be resolved. And the longer we put things off, the more these issues infiltrate other aspects of our lives, influencing decisions, relationships, and even our health. The problem is that the body takes its toll. The mind can handle a frenetic pace for a while, but the body starts to show signs: extreme fatigue, insomnia, pain without apparent cause. All of this can be a reflection of a life lived without pause. And when we ignore these signs, we're essentially pushing our own ability to live to the limit. It's like accelerating a car without ever stopping for gas. At some point, it simply stops, and usually not at the most convenient time. Another issue is that in our haste, we fail to live in the present. We're always projecting the future or reminiscing about the past, but we rarely experience the present. Jung believed that integration of the self only occurs when we are aware of the present moment, because it is in it that things truly reveal themselves. When we live in a rush, we pass through places, people, and experiences as if they were blurs, accumulating moments we can't even remember later. And here comes a curious paradox. Often people in a hurry are afraid of wasting time, but it's precisely this rush that makes them miss the most important moments. After all, being present is far more valuable than simply being in motion. The real risk isn't falling behind in the external world, but becoming too distant from one's own internal world. The solution: it's not simply slowing down physically, it's changing your relationship with time. It's allowing yourself to pause, even if they're uncomfortable at first. It's understanding that stopping doesn't mean failing or being lazy, but creating an opportunity to reconnect. And perhaps most importantly, it's having the courage to look at what the rush was hiding. Because when we face it head-on, we discover that most of the time, what was there wasn't as scary as it seemed. When we decide to face what haste tries to hide, something curious happens. We begin to notice patterns that previously went unnoticed. Small gestures, automatic choices, exaggerated reactions. All of this begins to make sense when understood as part of a larger mechanism. Jung said that to understand what truly moves us, we must descend into the depths of the unconscious. And this descent, inevitably, requires time, patience, and above all, presence. You can't do it in a hurry. It's like exploring a dark cave. You need to go slowly, carefully, because rushing only increases the risk of tripping and hurting yourself. But we live in a culture that teaches exactly the opposite. From a young age, we hear that time is money and that if you stop, you lose. We're conditioned to associate movement with progress and pause with laziness. This conditioning infiltrates so deeply that even when the body craves rest, the mind insists on inventing new tasks. And in the midst of this, we distance ourselves from ourselves, as if each commitment were more important than the very meaning of the life we're living. The saddest thing is that when we finally stop, sometimes because a crisis forces us to, we realize that so much has passed without us having truly experienced it. Deep conversations have been postponed. Small joys, like smelling the coffee in the morning or watching the sun set, leisurely, have been swallowed up by busy schedules. And that later often never arrives. When we realize it, we realize we were efficient, but not fully realized. Haste also masks emotional weaknesses. It's common for people in a hurry to pride themselves on their ability to solve everything quickly, but they rarely admit that, when they slow down, they feel a nagging emptiness. This emptiness is like a dark room we avoid entering. Jung said that entering this room is essential to finding parts of ourselves that have been left behind, fears, sadness, forgotten dreams. And the irony is that the more we try to avoid this room, the more it influences our lives without us realizing it. I remember a friend who always said she was on the run. She worked, studied, took care of the house, and even took on a side project to avoid sitting idle. One day, at a cafe, she confessed to me that when she was alone and with nothing to do, she began to feel a deep anguish. And it was this anguish that she was escaping with each scheduled appointment. It was at that moment that I realized her rush was actually an attempt to silence something screaming inside. When we understand that rushing is a disguise, we start asking different questions. Instead of, how can I get more done, we start asking, what really matters to me? This shift in perspective is liberating, but also frightening, because it forces us to take responsibility for our choices. We can no longer blame time or circumstances. We need to face that often we ourselves have hidden behind rushing to avoid making difficult decisions. The good news is that it's possible to transform this relationship over time. It's not about dropping everything and living in isolation, but about creating conscious moments of pause, even in the midst of your routine. It can be something simple, like drinking coffee without looking at your phone, walking aimlessly, or just sitting in silence for a few minutes. These moments gradually teach the mind that silence is not an enemy, but an ally. And over time, what once seemed unbearable begins to bring peace. When this happens, life changes pace, not because obligations disappear, but because we're no longer slaves to them. We become more selective about where to place our energy, and this restores to us a power that haste had stolen, the power to live with intention. And that's when we understand what Jung meant when he said that true freedom comes from self-knowledge. Something that haste, no matter how efficient, can never offer. When we begin to live with more intention, haste stops being an autopilot and becomes a tool. It doesn't disappear completely. After all, there are times in life when we need to act quickly, but it ceases to be the default mode. And it's at this point that we realize that silence, once so uncomfortable, becomes fertile ground for ideas, clarity, and even better decisions. Jung argued that the mind needs pauses to process and integrate experiences. Without them, we continue to accumulate experiences like someone stacking papers in a drawer, never organizing them. And the problem with living this way is that at some point that drawer overflows. It's in this overflow that many find themselves forced to change, an anxiety attack, burnout, a relationship falling apart. These are signs that life is asking for a slowdown. What could have been done voluntarily and consciously ends up happening abruptly. And then comes the question so many avoid: why didn't I stop sooner? The answer often lies in the illusion that if we keep rushing, we'll avoid the pain. But pain that isn't faced transforms, seeps in, and returns in unexpected ways. When we start to observe our haste, we also realize how it influences our relationships. People who are always rushing tend to offer fragmented attention, always focused on the next step. This creates invisible distances, even with those we love most. Have you ever noticed how easy it is to be physically present but mentally absent? This is how bonds weaken without anyone noticing. It's not that there's a lack of love, it's that there's too much distraction. And affection, to grow, needs presence. Another important point is that slowing down makes us notice things that previously went unnoticed. A conversation at the bus stop, a kind gesture from a stranger, the sound of rain hitting the window. Small details that suddenly seem to gain color and meaning. It's as if the world, previously blurred by the rush, regains its clear contours. And it's not just the external world that changes. The internal one does too. We begin to notice emotional patterns, automatic reactions, and even memories that were buried. That's when we begin to touch what the rush so desperately tried to hide. Jung said there is no awakening of consciousness without pain. But this pain doesn't have to be dramatic or unbearable. Often it's just the discomfort of facing oneself, head-on, admitting weaknesses and accepting that we don't have all the answers. Haste, with its constant busyness, acts as a temporary anesthetic. But anesthesia, when prolonged too long, doesn't cure. It merely postpones the moment of treatment. And, little by little, we discover that the courage to slow down doesn't lie in making big changes all at once, but in creating microspaces of awareness throughout the day. 5 minutes of deep breathing before starting work. A walk without headphones. A dinner without a cell phone on the table. It's in these simple things that transformation begins, and over time we realize that it's not the world that's slowed down, it's we who have learned to move at our own pace. In the end, what haste tries to hide is not a monster ready to destroy us, but a part of us that craves care. A part that, suffocated by the rush, just wanted a little attention so it could flourish. And when we offer that attention, everything changes. We begin to live more lightly, more presently, and more connected to what truly matters. Life stops being a race and becomes a journey. And on that journey, every step, no matter how small, counts. Did this story touch you in any way? Then tell me in the comments what your haste has tried to hide. I'll read each story carefully. And if you're not already subscribed, now's the time. Subscribe to the channel to continue receiving reflections that, like this one, can change the way you see the world and yourself.